All right, everyone. So we are getting started today with scopes and closures. Before we do that, I do have a really quick poll. Like there will be only 2 seconds for this poll. So everybody make sure you head over to Slido so we can see the poll. So let me run the first question. It literally only be 2 questions, but the questions are kind of relevant to what we're discussing today. So first, I'm gonna do the first question. All right, which variable type can be redeclared and reassigned? What do you guys have? Okay, let's get some answers in there. I'm gonna show the correct answer in about 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right, so the correct answer is var. Let and const cannot be redeclared and reassigned. They have their own rules, so it's good to know. Also remember var has a certain type of scoping that allows those things to happen. So keep that scoping in mind. All right, last question, just for our quick poll today. Which variable types are block scoped? Okay, give it a few more seconds. I'm sure the correct answer. It is let and const. Okay. So remember this block scoping. Remember variable types, the different variable types that can be redeclared, reassigned, what can be reassigned. And as we know, for everybody who didn't choose var, that's really good because var is global scoped. So we're going to jump into that in a second. But before I do that, I want to get to Slack. And I want to ask a quick question. So let's start with a question for the day. How are we feeling about JavaScript so far? Give it thumbs up, thumbs down. You can do a question mark. You can give a comment, whatever. Just want to know how everybody's feeling. Awesome. A bit tough. Okay. Okay, great. Good. We got some mixed feelings, and that's totally normal. JavaScript is not an easy concept to just jump into. So don't feel like you're totally messing up. If you feel like you're behind, it's totally fine. All right, so let's jump into some code. So everybody should have this code open, this code pen. Once again, as I always mention, you can either follow along and maybe try again later, but you don't have to code with me, or you can just watch and see how I'm doing things, or you can also try to keep up. Always remember that this link that I send every time I hit save, once you refresh it, you'll have the most updated code that we're discussing in this lecture. If you do have your code pen open, also remember maybe to change your settings. So behavior, I'm going to turn off saving automatically and auto updating my preview. Okay, so it's save and close. It's not closing for some reason, so I hope it's saved. All right, there we go. All right, so let's get started first with scope. So everything we're going to talk about today with scope and closure and things like that are most likely going to be stuff you see on an interview, especially a JavaScript interview. Definitely not HTML and CSS, but definitely some type of web dev interview that is involving a JavaScript role. So first thing we're going to talk about today is scoping. So we've touched a little bit on scope. You guys should have done that last week with Britt, where you talked about different variables and how var, let, and const have different type of scoping. And you heard a little bit about block scoping, so that would totally make sense. But now we're going to talk about all the 3 different types, right? So first, let's get everyone's opinion in the class thread. What is scope? How would you all define what scoping is? Any answers in the Slack channel? No? Okay. Where data can be accessed, order of operations. I like that, Michael. That's actually a good one. Order of operations is a good way to think of it. Relation to the code block. Okay, these are all great answers. Frame of reference, accessibility. Okay, awesome. So you guys have a good idea of what scoping exactly is. So I guess I'll put a smaller definition here, right? So scope answers the question of where are my variables and functions, and who are they available to? So we talk a lot about variable scoping, but please note that functions also have some type of scope. So the first thing we're going to talk about is global scoping. Global scoping. Okay. So if I do something like this, const cohort, and your cohort is Web 41, this is now available to everyone and everywhere and everything. And so I'm going to ask another thread. We're going to ask a lot of questions to make sure everybody's keeping up. Okay. So why is this variable available to everyone and everything? Oops, can I type this question right? AKA, why is it global? Right, because it's not in a function. It's not within anything. Perfect. Okay, everybody, we're good. We're good. We're keeping up here. So let me add a little note here. This is a global function. Global variable, because it is not within a function or block of code. And you might not understand what I mean by block of code just yet, but we'll get to that definition a little later in the class. So if I also add two other variables, right? If I do let school equals lambda, boom, that's also global. Var track equals web. Oops. This is also global. So these are all three of these are now global. However, let me inspect, right? So you guys hopefully have seen this before. This would be like your browser dev tools. And it kind of tells you what the browser, how the browser sees your code or how it can break down your code, right? So we can look at console. You can literally do JavaScript right in the console. Hopefully this isn't a new concept. And so when we're talking about the browser and we're talking about what's global, we're talking about what is available to the window object. And the window object is exactly this window right here, right? So I'm gonna make a quick note here. In the browser, the global scope is called the window. So now anytime we make any functions here, any variables here, anything like that, we're referring to stuff within this window. So the truth be told, when we're talking about scoping, I asked a question today in the poll of what two variable types have block scoping, right? And that was const and let. So even though technically right here in this code of CodePen, we have const, let, and var, and all of these three things can be seen as global because they're not within a function or within a block scope. The window itself, the window object that is a part of the console, will not actually see var, let, and const the same. So if we were to do the same thing, if we said var, and I'm gonna do a different one. I'm gonna say var test variable is equal to showing this is global. So we have a nice little string here, right? And I do window dot test variable, it's gonna showing this is global, okay? But if I do let another test equals showing this is not global, and I hit enter, and I want to access it by doing window dot another test, nothing comes up. So the window object, the browser itself, will not see let and const variables as global. Even though they're technically not in a function, they're not in anything. The only thing that the actual browser will see as global, technically by its rules, would be any vars, Anything with let or const will not work. So good, please. Does the window object make sense? Axe in Slack. If it doesn't make thumbs up, thumbs up. Any thumbs down? We're good so far. We're good so far. Okay, I'm getting a good amount of thumbs up, so I'm going to keep going. Okay. So we're also talking about scoping as well. I'm going to close this out. We also have functions, right? So you can have a function, and we're going to say sprint 3. Maybe say study. Oops. Okay. And we're going to say console.log. We are studying, and then I'm going to put this in there. So whatever variable is passed in. Okay. And so this is now, this function also has global scope. This function also has a global scope because it can honestly be accessed anywhere now within the code. So everything we've been doing so far has been mostly in the global scope. And if I just do sprint 3 and I pass in JavaScript, okay, and I hit save and I hit run, then our console should be showing this. We are studying JavaScript. So this is still technically in a global scope. And we're going to talk about how functions can have a different type of scoping a little later on when we talk about closures. But technically, like we said, anything not in a function or not in some nested block of code will technically be global. When we're talking about variables, const, let, and var, what we're looking at right here, CodePen and different code editors will see this as global, but if we're talking about the actual window object or the browser, it will not recognize let and const as global. So it was a quick little review. So I'm going to do a little note on that though. So just to review really quickly what we just discussed. Okay, anything that is in global scope is attached to the window object, which I just showed you all, except for const and let variables. Okay. So now I'm gonna do another question to see what everybody thinks. Is global scope a good programming practice? What do we think? Different replies? No, perfect. Okay, so in almost all cases, using global scope is not a good idea. But before we actually go into why it's not a good idea, we will kind of go into the other types of scoping first. But overall, programming practices, you won't really use global unless like a function. Function scoping for function global scoping is fine because it's a function. We're talking about variables, and I'll say that in the case of variables. In the case of variables, global scoping is not the best thing. All right. So now let's talk about function scope. So if we were to do something like, we'll start with a nice little examples. Before I do that, I'm going to comment out this code so it doesn't affect our current code. So let's talk about function scoping. Okay. So we have track equals web. We're going to do the same thing we did before, right? And this time we're going to do function lambda. Okay. I'm going to make that a new line. All right. And we're going to do const cohort inside of the function, and we're going to say web42. Oops. Okay. And if I do console.log cohort, I hit save and I hit run, What happened? Nothing is happening. Something should be happening. Run it. No. Did I? Oh, I didn't call Lambda. Okay, sorry about that. And then I call the Lambda function. Save, run it. Then we're gonna see Web42. So now let's say after Lambda, I wanna do console.log cohort. Oops. Question for those in Slack. What will be the output of line 31? Undefined, undefined, undefined. Awesome. So you guys all got it. Just save, run it. Great, cohort is not defined, as you guys know, because it has a function scope. So cohort now has a function scope and can only be accessed within the Lambda function. So I'm glad you guys all understand that. And I'm gonna comment this out because we know why that doesn't work. And if I do console.log track, I'm gonna ask another question. Okay, will line 28 run? Okay, everybody's saying yes. And that is because we now see that track has a global scope. So this will run because track has a global scope. Okay. So we see how that all kind of worked out. So I'm really good about, everybody is good at understanding this right now. I'm sorry if we feel like line 28 might have been repetitive, but I want to make sure we can see the different scoping, compare the two, and things like that. Okay, so we understand that cohort has a function scope. It can only be accessed here. This line will not work because cohort is function scoped. And this line will work because track is globally scoped. So now I want to do another example. It'll be very similar to this. So I'm going to do the same thing. We're going to have const track is equal to web. Okay. We're going to do function lambda again. And this time we're going to say const cohort is equal to web42. And inside, we're also gonna have another track. I'm gonna say maybe UX instead of web. And we're gonna console.log cohort and console.log track. And of course, I'm gonna call Lambda to make sure these run. So question for the class. What is the output of line 40? What will track console log this time? Will I get an error? Will I get UX or will I get web? Okay, everybody's saying UX. So let's run it and let's save it. And we still have web42 and UX. And that is the totally correct answer. So the reason why this works is what happens is when your browser is running the code and it's looking through things, right? It'll say, for example, console log track. Okay, so what it does is this thing called scope lookup. And scope lookup is going to see, okay, we have track here. So is track available within my local scope, like where I am? Because this line is technically in a function, right? So it'll look here and it'll say, is it technically in this function? It is, boom. What would happen up here in this example, right, was when we were saying, okay, console.log track, we're looking here. Is there any track within the local scope? No, it's not. So it's gonna look unto the next level of scoping. So wherever function is nested. So let's say this function is in another function, it will look at the above function and say, okay, is track available there? No, it's not. And it's gonna keep going up until it gets to that global scope, which in this case, it goes straight to the global scope and it'll say, is track there? It is, so track must be web. Okay, so I'm gonna do a quick little, some notes on that, so this isn't too confusing. So scope lookup. Variables that are not found inside, oops, I cannot spell. Found inside of a function will go up a level higher. So saying it'll go from being in this function to going to the next function to checking eventually till it gets up to global. And look in the next scope for the variable. So when it's looking for track, the first example will say, I don't have track. Let me look a level higher and check if track exists there. The second example found it within the function and did not need to go a level higher. Okay, so hopefully that all makes sense. Okay, and so another concept I want to talk about is when we have two variables with the same name. So we have track here and we have track here. This is called shadow variables. Okay, so you can name variables the same thing as long as they are not in the same scope. So we declare this variable here and we declare this variable here, but if we try to do like const track again equals, I can mobile maybe, right? Hopefully this was to break, but it would technically should break if I do console.log track, save, clear, run. All right, so track has already been declared. So because this track and this track are within the same scoping, this wouldn't work. But because these two tracks have different scopes, then shadow variables are allowed to kind of do their thing, right? So this would not work because there are two variables of the same name in the same scope. Okay. So overall, best practice would be to create a variable inside of a function with a different name though, because it can get a little confusing. So I'm gonna take this example here. I'm gonna comment this out. And I'm just gonna say, best practice, do not use the same name because it can get confusing. So if we're dealing with the same example we've been looking at, we have const track as web, function lambda. And then within lambda, you have the cohort variable and your track variable. The best thing to honestly do here would be to do other track, and then maybe just do a console.log of other track. And so though this concept does make sense, the concept that we discussed up here of shadow variables and how there's two tracks, but they have two different types of scoping, so that's why it works. Though that may make sense, something to always think about when you're writing code is think about readability and think about if somebody else is coming to actually look at your code and they have to build on it or they have to run it and they just want to get deep into the details. So you don't want to make things too confusing. So that's why best practice honestly is just to have not similar or same variable names. So this would be the best thing to do. All right. I'm gonna comment this out. It's a quick question in Slack. How are we feeling about function scope? Thumbs up, thumbs down. Everybody's looking good. If you have a thumbs down, that's okay. But so far, everybody's fine. I've got a rocket ship. All right. All right, so we're gonna talk about the next type of scoping. Okay, so let's talk about block scope. All right, so earlier we talked about var, let, and const. And we said in the poll, I asked you guys what variable types have block scoping. That was let and const, right? And so block scoping is anything that's kind of going within a block of code. And by block of code, I mean the curly braces. So technically, if we're looking at a function, right? Like we have these curly braces here and it's like, okay, could this be block scope? Technically, yes, but the answer is no, because it is a function right here, right? So I'll ask a question to see if anybody knows. What are other pieces of code that uses curly brackets or curly braces that are not functions? Objects, if, objects. Let's more talk about if statements, like conditionals, right? So block scope is variables can be accessed within the curly braces, not considered function scope if the block of code is not a function. So let's talk about if statements. So if we do if one is equal to 1, which that's always going to be true. And inside of here, we say const answer equals, it's true, okay? And I do console.log answer, all right? Ask a question for the class. What is the output of line 70? What do we got? What do we got? So I see undefined. Yes, yes, yes. Error, not true, undefined. So if I run it, answer is not defined. And that is because of this block scope. So this is an if statement. But because it has these curly braces here, it is now a block of code. And this will also work for loops, while loops, other types of conditionals, switch statements, things like that. So block scope will work for loops, conditionals, and etc. Okay. So what happens though, it's gonna change this up. If I go like this, I'm gonna copy this code and comment it out so we can see. What happens if I change const to var? So what is the output of line 78? Will it be the same? Will it still be undefined? Or will it give me something else? Okay, everybody's doing good. You're keeping up. We're here. Yes. So once I hit run, okay, we're going to say it's true. And this is because this will work because var makes answer a global variable. Okay. So that should totally make sense. We talked about var, let, and const. So the reason why up here didn't work was because we used const. If we did let here, it'd be the same thing. But the reason why this works down here is because we use var, which then makes it global. So if we did want to kind of have this block of code here, but we wanted to make it work for, oops. But we want to make it work with using let or const, then you could do let answer here. And we can put answer, it's true. And at this point, we would just be updating the variable, not redeclaring it. And if we save this, we'll clear this and we run it, then it would work. And it would also be still using that global scope. But once again, let's say we put this within like a function or something. That's why let kind of would be the better option than kind of running this example. So this example and this example are doing the same thing right now within CodePen because they're doing a global scope. But if we were to put these both into like a function or something, this would be the best practice. Best way to make our example work, especially if we put this inside of a function. Okay. So I'm trying to make sure that any notes I want to add before we move on. All right. I think we're good for now. So it's been about 35 minutes. So I'm going to give everybody a quick 3-minute break. And you guys can ask your questions in Slido. So 3 minutes. All right, I'm going to start this, and after 3 minutes, we'll come back and continue. Okay, so we are back now. Let's see what questions we have. Oop, let me turn off this poll. Sorry, everyone. All right. How do you invoke the inspector in CodePen? So it's not just the inspector in CodePen, it would be the browser tools inspector and anything. But even on this website, if you just hit right click on your mouse, right click and it has this little menu, you would just hit inspect and it would open up. Sometimes it'll open up at the bottom or in a separate window, but you'll kind of get this. What we were working on was in the console. So it would switch windows, you'd see different things. So this is like printing whatever Slido has. It's like a console.log. If when you first open it up in Elements, so you'll see like the HTML of the website and the CSS of the website. But if you want to deal with the console and see your console logs, you want to switch to the console window. Okay. What does it mean when you say it's attached to the window object? Do we want that? Is it good or bad? So it's not that it's necessarily good or bad. The window object is just what the browser, which here I'm using Chrome, but if you're using like Edge or Firefox, it is what the browser sees as just the global object. So a lot of times when we're writing code, what you see is globally anything that's not in a function. But what the browser sees as global is anything attached to the window object. So you don't have to manually attach things to the window object. It'll kind of just happen for you. So when we did var and we gave it a name, we did this, because it said as var, it manually is attaching things to the window object. You can technically do like window dot and give it something else, but window is just literally all the global stuff that you have available to you. That is all. Not defined is not equal to undefined, correct? Isn't undefined only valid for a declared variable? So undefined means like, yeah, it doesn't exist exactly. Not defined is saying like, they're kind of saying the same thing, but how about this? I look it up. So somebody might have a better answer than me. What's the difference between not defined and undefined? Let's see. Okay, in JS, here we go. Perfect. Someone did exactly what we needed them to do. So if a variable is accessed before defining, then JS will say it's just not defined. So if we're trying to access a variable before we actually say what it is, okay. If a variable is defined but not initialized, it doesn't have a value, then it is undefined. Hopefully that makes sense. Where's my questions? Okay. I thought we were not supposed to ever use var unless we absolutely have to. Yes, do not ever use var. You always want to use let. You always want to use const. I'm just showing you the difference when using var, like what it can do or how it might change up the results of your code. But best programming practices, always use let or const. Don't use var. Okay. So that is it for questions. So I'm gonna do another review, like a little hack, I want to call it. So for the notes here, just something to remember, right? We're talking about block scope or even function scope, but when you see curly braces, okay, think of them as gates. So they like to keep variables in, and that can be applied to function scope and block scope. Any variable created within those curly braces are kept within the curly braces, okay? This goes for function scope and block scope. So you want to keep them in. If you need to access a variable outside of the gates, then you shouldn't define it inside of the gates. So I say it's a hack, more like a mental hack, like a mental rule to remember. When you see gates, when you see curly braces, think of them as gates, it's keeping everything inside. So let's maybe do a little bit more of an example. So first let's do another one around a for loop example, right? So if we do for, and we do var I is equal to 0, and we do I is less than 10, and we do, oops, and we do I plus plus. And within those curly braces, we do console.log I. Okay. And then here we'll do console.log and say I is, do it like this instead. Oops. I don't know why it doesn't like me today. Okay. I is, okay. So if we do this, I'm going to ask the question to the class. What is the output of line 96? Anybody know? Undefined, undefined. Anybody else have any other possible undefined? I is undefined. Okay. So before I run that, I'm going to comment this out. Everybody's saying I is undefined. Save, clear. Let's run it. So we have 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, which you know is happening from the console log. And line 96 said I is 10. And the reason why this is happening is, Devin, you just said it. It's because I is a var. That was a trick question, and it might have gotten you a little bit. So this line will print I is 10 because I is a var. So it's still technically global. Even though it's in a for loop, this is still technically global. Though it is in a for loop, it is still technically global. It's actually a really good reason why you don't want to use var or you don't want to do global scope. Because a lot of times when you are, if you have several for loops, you still do for loop, variable I, and you technically would be redeclaring, reassigning I every time, and it can get a little tricky. So the best way to do this is if we did for, and we do let I equals 0, I is less than 10, I plus plus, and we do console.log I, okay? And we say console.log I is, boom, and I'm going to go like this, save, clear, and run. But then we get exactly what everybody was expecting, because now we've given a let, and now I is only working within this block of code. It's only working within the for loop. It cannot work outside of that. Okay. So block scoping is honestly one of the best things to do, because once again, if we did var here and we had two separate for loops that may have had two separate things, like maybe this was doing console log I plus 1 and this is just console logging I, it could get a little tricky. You might get values that are like, what is going on, especially when you start doing programming that is asynchronous. And when I talk about asynchronous, I mean like it doesn't run in this order. Asynchronous code could like look at this for loop and look at this for loop and technically run them at the same time. And now your I is like a whole bunch of different values you weren't expecting, versus if we do let, that kind of solves that issue for you. All right, so I'm gonna add a note here. Using let within the for loop keeps I block scoped. This line will show that I is not defined. Okay. So we're gonna do another example, and this example will also kind of tackle some local or function scoping. If you hear me say local, that's another name for it. Local or function scoping, same thing. But it'll also give you an idea of how scope lookup works, right? So let's do another example. So let's say we have const dog is equal to, my dog's name is Lola. Okay, and we do function call dog. So we just say console log. And we're gonna say, hey Lola, dog. Okay. All right, and then we have function puppy. Oops. I'm gonna say const dog in here. I don't have another dog, but I really want one, and I want to name him Nico, so we're gonna say Nico. I'm gonna do call dog in here. So we're actually calling this function within the puppy function, and I'm gonna run puppy. So the way this goes is we're calling puppy, we're invoking it, it's gonna run, and then puppy is gonna invoke call dog, and that's gonna run, right? So where's my console? I did not mean to do that, sorry. Clear, save. So question, when call dog is invoked, what is line 110 going to print? I don't know why I cannot type today. What is line 110 going to print once we actually call it? So we have Nico, Nico, Nico. Someone said Lola. All right. So I'm going to, actually, did I run it already? Wow, the answer's already there. But just in case anybody missed it, because maybe you were answering, I'm gonna run it. And the answer is actually going to still be, hey, Lola, okay? So this is what is referred to as lexical scoping. So we see here that line 110 still prints Lola. This is called lexical scoping. And what this means is that the way scope lookup happens is where the functions are defined is not, functions are defined is where the scope matters, not where they are run or invoked. So here, call dog is technically defined in the global scope. This is where it's created. So when it's looking at hey dog, it is going to look for a dog in the global scope because there isn't dog within it locally. And so even though we're calling it within puppy, it's not where it's defined. It's not defined within puppy. If call dog was defined inside of this, then absolutely dog would then be Nico. Okay. Kasim can reach out, never in. I'm not sure what that means, but the answer is hey Lola. So hopefully that makes sense. So if we wanted to do something maybe where you do get what you're looking for, well, actually, before we even do that, I'm gonna do another one. I'm gonna edit this a little bit. So I'm gonna copy this. I'm gonna save so you guys can stay with me, right? So we're gonna do this. All right. And now we're gonna actually take in dog. Okay. I'm gonna say call dog, and we're gonna pass in another name, some random name. Just say Sparky. Okay. So now we have 3 different dogs here. We have the global dog, we have dog as a parameter, and we have dog set as a local variable within puppy. So now, what is line 126 going to print? Are we gonna see Nico, Sparky, or Lola? What do we think? What do we think? So some answers I see here. We see Sparky, Sparky, Nico, Lola. So we've seen all of them. So I'm gonna save and I'm gonna clear this. Make sure these are commented out so we don't have that problem. Okay, and we're gonna run it. And so we're gonna see, hey, Sparky. And so the reason why you see Sparky is because values passed in as parameters fit within the function or local scope we discussed. So what's gonna happen is we're gonna see 126 says, okay, hey dog, and it's gonna do that scope lookup we talked about. It's gonna say, is dog, what's the word? Is dog available in the function? Is it a local variable within the function? And technically it is because this parameter is set here. So whatever is sent in, that's exactly what's going to print out. Okay, so within this example, scope lookup does not go too far. It doesn't. Everything's fine. It works the way it's supposed to work. Awesome. All right. So now we're gonna do another example. We're gonna take this again, go like this, okay? And we're gonna change it up one more time. And let's say we do const dog and give it another name. I have so many, we're gonna say Buster. I used to have a dog named Buster. Okay. So now I'm gonna ask again. What is line 142 going to output? Which name? We have so many dogs, it can get a little confusing now. Anybody know? What do you guys got? Buster, 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 Buster. All right, save. Clear this, run it. So actually we have identifier dog has already been declared. Ooh, nothing, dog has already been declared. Yes, Nick. Kudos to Nick, you got it. All right. So this will break because dog has already been declared. So remember we talked about shadow variables and how you can have two variables with the same name if they're not in the same scope, but you cannot have two variables with the same name within the same scope. And technically, dog was defined or declared here before it was declared here. So that's why that doesn't work. Now, what if I do something different? If I do const dog, I'm gonna change this up a little bit. Let's just say we're just gonna output dog, right? Oh, I don't want this to be a comment. Okay, if I do const dog and we give it a blank string, okay, and I say save, we're gonna clear this, and I run it. That wasn't what I was expecting. Normally, what would happen, or what I was expecting, is this dog would automatically get set to Sparky, but technically we are redeclaring it, so it's happening again. Totally makes sense. All right. So, though we may expect this to take on the value from the parameter, it is still a double declaration. Comment that out because it's not going to work. Save, clear. And if we run it again, we should once again just get Sparky. All right. So I'm just going to ask a quick question. My mouse is stalling. I don't know what's happening. Sorry, everybody. My screen just went black and I have no, there we go. Okay. All right. So thread, please. Does this scope lookup example make sense? You can give a thumbs up, thumbs down, or maybe ask what didn't make sense to clarify. All right, everybody's good so far. We don't have any major questions. I don't see any popping up yet, okay? I'm gonna move on now. So if you do have a question, put it in Slido and we can get to it. Actually, I take that back. I'm actually gonna give people chances to ask questions in Slido. It's been another 30 minutes, so I will give another 3-minute break before we move on to the next concept of closures. So let me reset this. Start. All right, everybody have a good break. Okay, I hope everybody's back. Let me see if we have any questions in Slido. What is the purpose of things being global or block scoped? So global just means you pretty much can access it anywhere with any within any function at any time anywhere within your code. It's not a great practice, as we discussed earlier, because sometimes you have things that are globally scoped and you might edit them somewhere you weren't aware of, or change its value or reassign it. Block scope is you just want to keep it within your for loop, keep it within your if statement. And a good like thing with block scope is exactly what we talked about with for loops. You know, you don't want your var I to be used outside of that for loop, because that I is technically just supposed to be used as an accessor or counter for that loop. So once you use var I and then make it global, it can be accessed other places. It could even be technically accessed in another for loop where you may be using I. So you want to use let in your for loop, because then it makes things block scoped. It's a little better. Why didn't we learn this before writing JS code? This technically should have been in your warm up. If it wasn't, we can absolutely look into maybe how to add it. So I would talk about, you can either submit it to me, feedback on like the flow of your modules, or you can submit it to like student success and give feedback on the curriculum as well. Can console.log track be used outside the function scope? I think we're talking about in our example. Can console.log be used outside the function scope? Where did we do this? Track. So technically, I guess I'm hoping we're talking about this example, but here, yes, console.log track can be used outside of the function scope. If we did console.log track here, this would totally work. It would totally print. I was just trying to show you the example within a function scope, but yes, it can, this would work. Okay. I've matched the code you typed I is I, but exactly when I run it comes back as I is I instead of I is 10. So you have quotes, you don't want to use quotes, right? The example I have in this for loop. All right, this one. You don't want to use quotes. I think quotes is next to like, I'm on a MacBook next to the return key. You want to use this like, I don't know the name of it. It's like a more slanted. If you do quotes, it's just a string. Once you do that little slant, it is now able to use ES5 and ES6 notation and how we can use variables within it. And that button should be right above your tab button. So it has like the little squiggly and then it has like the dash. And that's how you can access that instead of using regular quotes. Regular quotes will just make it a regular string. You won't be able to access variables inside of it. There are times when there's no run button in CodePen. How do I fix this? That might be if there's no run button. That could easily be if, I don't know if your thing is too small, like if you're condensing it, then it might disappear. But if it's just disappearing, that might be a glitch of CodePen. Why didn't we learn it last week before touching functions or anything related? So that's just the flow of, I get what you're saying now. That is the flow of the curriculum. I mean, we're talking about scoping right now. And honestly, learning scoping in the beginning isn't anything too important until we start talking about what we're talking about this week. So last week, you really just learned about variables and you learned about arrays and objects, and you didn't really have to deal with scoping, or you didn't do any examples around global scoping or local scoping then. This week, we're going to talk about more things. We're talking about closures. We're going to talk about callback functions and more in-depth stuff. And that more in-depth stuff is when scoping is going to actually mean more. So we didn't want to add scoping last week where it's like the lighter stuff and it doesn't really apply yet, versus this week it'll apply more. How do I change the view in my CodePen? It's viewed in. I'm on a MacBook. So me being on a MacBook, I would do command minus, the minus sign. I think if you're on a Windows machine, it would be control minus sign. I think so. I think that's the right answer. All right. So we're going to continue now. I'm going to comment this back so it doesn't confuse us later. All right, so now we're going to just show example of scoping with functions. But we keep talking about global function, block scope, and we only really been doing variables. So I'm just going to do a quick example of scoping with functions. So if I create a function and I say function, say hi, pass in a name, okay. This function right now is globally scoped. It's available to anybody. I can easily just do say hi, and I can pass in my name. Nothing's gonna happen because I didn't put anything in it, but I can access this function easily anywhere, any point now, right? If I actually add another function within this function, because you can do that, and I say console.log name.to uppercase, and to uppercase is just a built-in string function of JavaScript, and it is exactly what it sounds like. It is going to take this string and make all the letters uppercase. That is all. So now if I do this and I do yell, right? Question for the class. Will line 164 work? In Slack, anybody? No, you have to call inside the function. Exactly, save. So right now I have say hi and I have yell. So if I hit run, honestly, we should get an error. I believe that should be the only thing we see, right? Say hi isn't working because we haven't called yell technically in its correct scope. And line 164 is gonna break because yell is not defined in global scope. So I'm gonna comment this out and I'm gonna say yell here. Save. So now line 165, when it does say hi, it's gonna see that yell is declared and created, and then it's actually gonna call it and actually run it. So if I clear and I run it now, then we should see Gabby in all caps. So this kind of shows that this function is locally scoped or locally or function scoped and can only be called within the say hi function. All right. So quick question to get the pulse of the class. Does function scoping make sense? You do thumbs up, thumbs down, or ask a question if something isn't clear. Everybody's looking good so far. Everybody's looking good so far. All right, awesome. All right. So talk a little about this. Now we're gonna go into another concept. So I'm just gonna comment those out for now. Scroll up a little bit, save. All right. So now we're gonna talk about this concept of hoisting. So you might have seen this a little bit. Normally when we create a function, right? We say function, we're just gonna call it working. And we're gonna say console.log this works. And normally you would see me call the function down here. And if we save this and run this, this should work no problem, right? But now what if I comment this out and I do working up here? Question for the class. What do we expect from line 171? Undefined. Is work still? Okay, perfect. Good answer, Kasim. So if I save and I clear this and I run it, this will still work because of hoisting. So just to give a nice definition of it, hoisting in JavaScript allows you to access functions and variables before they have been created. And so when we say before they've been created, we literally mean like the function of the variable has been created just later on in the code. So we talked about earlier the difference between like undefined and not defined. If we technically commented out this would break because working is not defined anywhere at all in the code, right? So the two things that can be hoisted in JavaScript is function declarations and variable declarations. And that's it. That is it. And so this works because your JS compiler kind of takes two steps. So what the compiler does in the first place is it'll go through all of your code, and it'll take all of your function declarations and move them to the top of your file. You won't physically see that, but that is how the JavaScript compiler is running. So it's going to go through all of them, and it's going to take all of your function declarations and push it to the top. So mentally, it has every single function declaration, what it's supposed to do, all the way at the top of the code now. So it'll kind of order this for you anyway. And then it's going to rerun again. And when it reruns again, then when it sees working, it's going to look at the definition at the top. Okay, so hoisting works because the JS compiler will take all of your function declarations and move them to the top of the file. So technically, it will all exist before invocation. Can I not spell invocation? I can't. Invoking the functions. I'll say it that way. Okay. So same thing. If we do another example, and I'm going to comment out this code really quick. Another example of hoisting. So we're gonna do this kind of this exact same thing we had before. We're gonna start with, we're gonna call working before we even define it. And then we're gonna say function working. I'm gonna keep this part the same, console.log. Let me scroll up a little bit. Console.log, it works. And then we're gonna do another line, console.log, add to 4. So add is gonna be another function that we have available. And then we're gonna say function add num1, num2, and it's just going to return num1 plus num2. So if I clear it and I save it, do another, save it and I run it. So this add function will still work because of hoisting. So the compiler is going to go through, it's going to say, oh, function working, function add, and it's going to put all of these at the top. In the specific order of like how you might need to access things, it's going to put them all the way at the top. And then when it runs through your code, actually, again, it can then say, okay, I know where add is or what add is supposed to do. I'm supposed to do num1 plus num2. And same thing working is like, I know what working is supposed to do. It's supposed to print these two things. So honestly, this is a small concept we wanted to go over to touch. I don't think it's super useful. Some people actually write their code that way anyway. Like they'll write all the function definitions or the variable, declarations or the variable declarations at the top and then write all their code. That is some companies' practice. Not to say it's the best practice. What you'll learn is when you start working, that different companies have different rules or different ways that they expect things to go. It's kind of like when we talked about the CSS reset and we saw those different types of resets. There isn't like one right way of doing it. It's whatever reset the company wants to use. It's the same concept here. You can write your code the way that we normally do it, where it's like, we'll put the function here and then call it and then do another function and then call it. That's fine. It's really how the practices of your company and what they want to do. So if you do hoisting, no one's going to look at you and say, this is terrible. If you don't do hoisting, no one's also going to look at you and say, this is terrible. It's just what practice makes you feel comfortable or what practice your company wants to follow by. That is all for hoisting. All right. So now let's jump into closures. Talk about closures for a bit. So we kind of saw an example of closure when we talked about this right here. Okay. Function yell is a function within say hi. That's kind of a small example of a closure. Let's really get into it. So closures can seem like a scary concept, but we're gonna make it make sense. Okay. So closures essentially, think of the concept of nesting, which we've talked about nesting before. You've seen the if statement within another if statement, you know, that's nesting. And now you've seen a function within a function. That's also nesting. And you'll have parents and you'll have children. Okay. So closures give us the ability to put functions together. When a function is created in another function or nested within another function, okay? Then we have a parent function and a child function. And so what this allows us to do is children can then access stuff that their parents have, but parents can't access stuff that their children have. And you think about that in real life, right? Like you got genes from your mom and you got genes from your dad. However, the genes that you got from your dad, you can't give back to your mom and vice versa. So it's the same kind of concept. So we're going to do this really like long example, but we're going to break it down. So just stay with me here. It might take a little minute and that's okay. It's not a big deal. So let's start with a function and we're going to say country. Okay. And we're going to say, country name. Okay. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to add these comments by the curly braces so you can see where every function starts and where every function stops. So start of country function. Okay. End of country function. And I'll even show how we would call it. So we just say country. And I'm gonna say Canada. We're gonna do Canada. Shout out to Brit. I don't know if she's on the call. I don't think she is today, but Canada. All right. And within country, we're gonna have two variables, which is language one. And we're gonna say it's French. Okay. And then we're gonna say language two, which is English. Okay. And we're simply gonna say console.log. Money sign, language one, and language two are the official languages of country name. Okay, so if we were to run this right now, I'm gonna clear this, I'm gonna save it. We're gonna make sure there's nothing else console available. Let me just turn these off really quickly so we don't have any conflicting stuff. Okay. So save it and we hit run. Then simply we should get French and English are the official languages of Canada. This should all make sense. We have a simple function. We passed in a parameter. We created local variables within it. And we just have a simple console log statement that accesses all the local variables of the country function, right? So now if I do function province, this is kind of like the yell function we saw earlier. Okay, and I'm gonna say province name. I'm gonna do the same thing I did before, where I'm gonna say this is the start of the province function. Okay, and this is the end of the province function. Okay. And I'm simply just gonna say console.log. Here we go. Province name, which is the local variable for province, is the most populated province in country name. And the main language is language 2. Okay, so it's kind of long, but bear with me. Oops. And we know this is the end of the province function. Because province is created within the country function, it can only be called within country function. So I'm even going to call it here. Let's say, oops, call province. And you see that it is still within the brackets of country because we have end of country function here. And if you look at province, we have province name, which is only available to province because it is local. It is not available to country name. So once again, we're talking about parents and children. So province is now a child function of country. And it can access things that the parent function has. And you see that here we have country name and language 2. But country cannot access province name because province name is tied to the child. So I'm gonna save this, I'm gonna clear it, and I'm gonna run this. And we should have 2 console log statements. So we have French and English are the most official languages of Canada. Oh, and undefined is the most populated province in Canada, and the main language is English. So this is obviously undefined because I forgot to pass in a province name. And so I'm gonna pass in Ontario. So let's save it, clear it, run it. And this should still work the same. So we see how we're still able to access Canada, we're still able to access English, and Ontario is just simply available to here. Okay, so now we're gonna go another level, and within province, I'm gonna do another function. Okay, so we're gonna do function city, and we're gonna say city name. Okay, and we're gonna say this is the start of the city function. This is the end of the city function. Okay, and within city, we're gonna do something simple. We're gonna say const food is equal to maple syrup. Okay, and we're gonna do console.log, and we're gonna say food is the national food of country name. So I'm also gonna call city and give it a name this time so I don't mess that up again. I'm gonna say Niagara Falls. Okay, and so city has to be called within province because it is local to province. So we have country, country has a nested function called province, province has a nested function called city. Save. So if you notice what I did here, I'm trying to add spaces so it looks a little cleaner in between. If you notice, city is accessing country name, which is a part of the country function. So I'm gonna do a thread. Will line 213 print correctly? What do we got? Any answers? Oh, well, that's true too. Thanks, Michael. That actually makes sense. After the semicolon, will it print correctly? Yes, yes. Anything else? Yes, yes. Okay, perfect. So we run it. We should have 3 console log statements. So we have French and English are the official languages of Canada. That's country. Ontario is the most populated province in Canada, and the main language is English. That's in province. City, maple syrup is the national. Wow, I have a typo. Is the national food of Canada. So yes, so just like once again, you might have properties or genetics that you get from your grandparents, children can access as far out as possible. It's just parents cannot. So technically, in the country function, we can't run city. That's not happening. I was comment this out. So now we're trying to call city within the country function. We know because it's the end of province. And if I clear this and I hit run, this will not work. So I hope this makes sense to everybody. So this will not work because city is nested in province. In the province function. Okay. Okay. And I'll put this back because this will actually work. Awesome. So now we kind of get this idea of closures and functions, and you kind of see how things can be nested and how they can work. And this is a long example, but I hope everybody was with me. All right, so I'm going to ask a quick question before we move on. Does this example make sense? If it doesn't make sense, ask a question within that thread. If it does make sense, give me all the thumbs up in the world or positive emojis that we got. Okay. How about city name? We could have used city name. We didn't really need to. You could have. It's just there. Is there a limit, or can you just keep making new functions forever? You technically can go forever. The reason why you wouldn't want to go forever is, once again, we talked about readability and making things complicated for people. So you wouldn't want to do that when we're talking about nested. If you have a bunch of like things that should be called by other things, and you might want to, and it's like a bunch of them, then you might want to go back to just global functions, and that's okay. And then, yeah, how about city name? We just put that there as an example, but you don't need to, it's not a big deal if we didn't use it. It's totally okay. Can you define closure again? So a closure is just a function within a function. That is it. It gives the ability to put functions together. So putting functions together, for example, is how we were able to do like province name is the most populated province, and country name. So province is technically a closure of country, and it's able to use both functionalities of province and country name. Funception. Yeah, it kind of is like Inception, actually. That's a good example. Okay. So now I'm gonna comment this example out. And we're actually gonna talk about an example on how you call closures later on, or call functions later on, right? So let's first talk about private variables. And I'm going to put this all the way up, and I'm gonna save it. Okay, so let's say we're gonna do something different now. Function game, and we're gonna pass in a parameter called sport, not sprot. Okay. Let score equals 0. Okay. And return function win score plus plus. Okay. And within here, we're gonna say return your sport game score is score. All right. So this might be throwing everybody for a loop because you probably have never thought about returning a function. Remember, you can technically return anything. You can return nothing, but you can return any type of value type within JavaScript. Technically, a function is a value type. And just to make sure everybody's still with me, is when considered a closure or nested function? Yes or no? What do we got here? Yes, so when is technically still, even though we're returning it, it is still a nested function, it is still a closure. And as you can see, it's accessing score. And the way we're gonna see this is private is we're gonna do a few examples here, right? So let's do one game. We're gonna say const hockey game. And we're gonna call game and we're gonna say hockey. Okay, I'm gonna save. And what's happening here is, if you think about it, if we run like any other function, when we do something like this, we're expecting whatever is returned from this side of the equal sign, whatever's returned here will then be the value of hockey game. So here we're saying, okay, game hockey, and it's going to return a function. So the inside of the win function will now be equal to hockey game. So just to see where everybody's thinking, what is the type of variable hockey game after line 236? Nobody's an answer in Slack? No one knows what hockey game will be, the type of, will it be a string, will it be a number, what would it be? What is the type? Yes, it'll be a function, exactly. And what can you do with a function? Anybody know? So what I'm gonna do is, we're gonna say console.log, and let's just console hockey game. That's it. So we can see what that type is. Did I comment everything out before that? I did. And we're gonna run it. And when you run it, you see that hockey game is equal exactly to now this function win. Okay. And so now technically you can go like this because it's a function, right? But what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna do console.log hockey game. And so the difference between this line here and this line here is we're simply printing what is hockey game. And here we're printing what hockey game returns because we're now invoking the function that it is once we put these parentheses here. And so we should see your sport game score is score, right? So I'm gonna do this a couple times. All right, and we're gonna save it, clear it, and run it. And so you see that it actually does increase. So it started with score 0, that is still kept in mind. And every time we're still increasing, we're still doing score plus plus, score plus plus, scores plus plus. And so we're now able to access this closure or this nested function outside of its parent function. And so I mentioned private variables. And so where private variables will come into play now, if I do const basketball game, and I say game, okay, and I say basketball, we know that line 246 score was at 5. If I do console.log basketball game, because we know we're gonna get return a function just like hockey game, okay, and I clear it, okay, what is line 245 going to print? What are we thinking here? Any ideas? We saw that hockey game ended at what, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The score was 5. Score will be 5. Someone said 6, someone said 1, someone said 1. So if I run it, I'm going to save it and we're going to run it. So your basketball game score is 1, and that's where the private variables come into play. So we're able to access this closure outside of its parent function, and that's great. But remember, we're returning it. So we're just returning whatever this is here. But every time we call it, we call this new instance here, it's not affecting the score of 0. So every time you call it, score is set to 0. So hockey game will see score is 0. And every time that it's incrementing, it's starting from that 0. Basketball game is starting all over again. It's starting from that 0 and incrementing it there. It is this score of 0 here is never actually affected once we are accessing the closure again over and over. Okay, so we're gonna save that. And so I'm gonna do a little note here so it'll make sense when you guys are looking back at it. So even though this score is the same variable name, because we created 2 separate win functions technically, because now hockey game is equal to win and basketball is equal to win, but they're their own copies. Each has their own private score variable. Now, what happens if I try to do this? Console log score. X in the chat. What is line 249 going to print? I keep doing that. I keep putting the semicolon, nothing if I do it that way. If I do it this way, sorry, everybody. Save, clear. Yes. So if I run it, we got a few undefined, not defined. And score is not defined because it is also function scoped, and we're also using let. So it's staying within those curly braces that we discussed. Okay. Awesome. So all in all, I just want to do a quick little summary. Okay. Closures are the ability for a child or inner function to access variables from a higher level scope, even after the variables have been called, closed, or terminated. And kind of saw that with that score. We're still accessing it, still updating, things like that. Okay, so I'm gonna ask a question and you guys can decide. We have about 20 minutes left, a little less than 20 minutes. How do we want to finish this out? We can either go over the first example of the project for today, of today's project, or do another example and questions. What are we thinking? Answer away in Slack. Go over project, attendance, then project. That's actually really good because I do need to give you guys the attendance code. So let me get that for you all in a second. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put like a minute break. And in the minute break, I'm going to get the attendance code for you all. And you guys can ask any last questions in Slido, and then we'll go over the project. Okay? So I'm gonna do this online timer in which I'm going to edit, give you all a minute, done, reset. And so everybody asks questions and I'll get the attendance code and I'll give you guys about 30 seconds or about another 2 minutes after while I'm going over Slido. Okay. So I'm going to open up the chat in the Zoom chat, not in Slack. Okay, the attendance code is being posted there right now. Boom. I'll even also put the link. And I'll do another 2 minutes to do attendance and ask questions. And then we can go from there. Reset. Start. So once again, and I will put it also, attendance code and the link is in the Zoom chat. Okay, 5 more seconds. Let's head over to Slido really quickly. Okay, slightly unrelated, but are things gonna get harder or easier after JavaScript? I understand it, but it's been really hard. And I've heard from staff that JS will be the hardest, but from students that React is harder. It's only getting harder from here. That is the truth. React is a part of JavaScript. It's a library you're gonna learn about, and React is really, really in depth. So. What situations would you use Clojure in? That could really depend. So you could use a Clojure within so many things. I can't even think of a real one. An example I could think of off the top of my head right now is if you're literally building a calculator. We've shown calculator examples before and like how to use add, subtract. But if you have an overall calculator function and within it, you have different child functions or child closures, that's add, subtract, things like that. So they can be accessed outside of the calculator. That's a real world example if you're building a calculator app. Is using strict mode recommended to prevent any bugs we've gone over so far? With the examples we're talking about, you can use strict mode. That'll also still help with everything. Strict mode is always good for bugs. In hockey game example, where can we say the closure is happening? The exact line. Okay, so if we're looking at the hockey game, the closure is here, 2:30. This function when is the closure. We're just returning it. So we're making the closure available to people outside of the parent function now. But the closure is when, line 2:30. I'm going to say this in case this hasn't been updated for anybody. With the city function, would you assign city function to a var and then reference it globally? City function. And your question was, could you assign city function to a var and then reference it globally? No, it still would have that scope with inside of it. It'd still be nested inside of it. So there wouldn't be a global thing. If you want to make it globally, you would just create it outside of the nested thing. It would be outside of country. Okay, so let's quickly we have our last 10 minutes to kind of go over the example. So if we're looking at module 1, if you don't know how to get here, you guys should be in web 1.3, web 42, if you go to modules, and then hit module 1 projects. We're gonna open the scope and closure challenge. We'll close this out. And it should open up to this, okay? And as we know, first thing you need to do is fork it. So I'm gonna fork my copy. Okay. And I'm gonna make this smaller. All right, and I'm going to clone it down. I think my thing is right here. Get out of here, okay. So I'm gonna do a git clone and make sure I'm cloning my copy. So before you clone, you wanna make sure it's your copy, make sure it's your username once again. So mine gcraft93, and then it's web module challenge, scope and closure git, enter. Okay, and then I'm gonna do code, web module challenge, scope and closure. Great, so we're gonna open this up. Okay. So let's make this big and I'm gonna open my terminal here, new terminal. So we should have this as well. First thing we're gonna do is npm install. Make sure you have everything that you're gonna need for this project. And npm installing, when every time you clone down a project, is not just a Lambda thing. That is an everyday developer thing. Anytime you're using a new code base or getting into somebody's code base, or even if you and a team member are working on the same code and there's been a pull request and you're just pulling down the newest code, always do an npm install, because you never know what new libraries or things like that might have been added or changed in your configurations. All right. So now let's look at our index.js. So we have task 1. This example shows how you might go about solving the rest of the task. So use the high order function, process first item below to do the following: receive an array of strings in a parameter. So string list, that's what this is. We're saying it's an array. Receive a callback function. Okay. That takes a string as an argument in a parameter. And return the results of the invoking callback function. So we didn't get to callback function, so I'm going to touch on that in this example. We're technically supposed to go deep into it tomorrow, but a callback function essentially is a function that you pass into another function. So we discussed returning a function, right? You can also pass them in as parameters. So here, what it says, receive a callback function that takes a string as an argument in a parameter, and return the result of invoking the callback function. So right now it's just showing you have this function here and it's expecting a callback, right? So we're gonna create that callback here. So it says process first item and it passes foo bar, and then it passes in a function to be called. But what I'm gonna do instead is to make this gonna be a little tricky, right? We're gonna do, oops. We are going to do, oops, function and it's saying take a string as an arguments parameter, and return the result of invoking the callback function and passing in the first element in the array, but it doesn't say what the function should be doing. But here it's just returning string plus string. So we're just gonna say add strings, okay? And it's gonna take a string parameter and it's returning string plus string. And so now what we wanna do is we wanna pass all of this to process first item. So you could do process first item and your string list, which it's an array, that's what it's expecting. We're saying foo, or we're saying bar in a string. Okay. And then we're gonna pass in this add strings. All right. And so what's important to note, what I did here is I'm not putting the parentheses here. If you put the parentheses here, you're actually invoking the function and it's actually gonna run right then and there. We don't want that. We wanna actually just pass the function to process first item. And then in process first item, so we have add strings, we're passing it to process first item. I hate that this keeps popping up. And then in process first item can then actually call it itself. So callback is just the parameter name for add strings, the same way string list is just the parameter names for this array. That is all it is. And so literally we're just returning whatever the result of add strings would be. So the way this would go is we would do, okay, we have foo bar, we have foo, we have bar, and we have add strings. We go to process first item. This would see foo and bar. This would see the add strings function. And then it would say return whatever the value of the function returns. So technically it would see add strings and it's gonna pass in string list, which at us would be foo. And then it would say function add strings. It's going to see foo. It's going to say return foo plus foo, which would be equal to foo foo. So it's going to return foo foo back to this line. And then foo foo is going to return that as well. I mean, process first item is also going to return foo foo because that's what it got back. So the difference between this line here and this line here is, well, one, it's a console log, but two, it actually created the function inline. And I know that can confuse some people. So I just put the function outside of it so you can actually see the function breakdown. But this right here is also a function. Like if I was to just like break it down a little bit, you would see that it looks like a function you guys see all the time. It's exactly the same, but they just did it in line. So I can see how that can be confusing. Okay. So I'm gonna ask thread, please. Yes, we can console log it. We absolutely can. So I'm gonna do console.log. Okay. And then I'm gonna save it. Make sure you save. npm run test watch. So everything should have failed because I didn't do anything yet. And you see console log is foo foo, just exactly what I said. So how all this did was we called process first item, we passed in foo bar, we passed in the add strings function. You go to process first item, it sees foo and bar, and it sees the add strings function. It's gonna call the add strings and pass in the first value of the array we pass in. So we know we're passing in foo. Add strings is like, okay, I have foo now. It's gonna return foo foo. So it's returning it back to this line. So this line will see foo foo, and then it's also gonna return it. And that console log is gonna print foo foo. So that's simple. We're gonna go more into callbacks tomorrow. So this is like one of those challenge of like, might have to look some stuff up, do a bit more research, but your warm up tomorrow can actually help you if you get a little caught up with callbacks. Don't get too frustrated with it. This is one of those challenges of like understanding the real life of a developer is you won't always have the answer. You won't have everything in front of you. Sometimes you have to research stuff and look into stuff. And so let's try to quickly look at task 1. So study the code for counter 1 and counter 2, then answer the questions below. What is the difference between counter 1 and counter 2? So we have a counter maker. and it takes a count of 0 and it's returning a function and it's returning a count. So this is actually just like what we did the game. We had a game and it had your score and it's returning another function. We returned win before. And we said counter 1 is equal to counter maker. So counter 1 is going to be equal to this counter function. Okay, versus counter 2 here. The difference between counter 1 and counter 2 is, okay, well, counter 1 is going to get back this closure, and it's not dealing with anything globally. It's doing everything locally and function scoped, and it has private variables, its own copy of count here. Versus counter 2 is dealing with private variables. I mean, it's dealing with global variables. So the count here is not private, and this count can technically be accessed anywhere else. Okay, so that's going over task 1 and task 2. Does the difference, well, actually task 1 and this example here. Okay. And so it's asking which of the two uses a closure. How can you tell? Your answer here would be counter 1. And in what scenario would counter 1 code be preferable? And what scenario would counter 2 be better? So just think about that a little bit. Think about the examples that we talked about, but counter 1 code would be preferable if we're trying to make several counters that have its own private variable. Scenario 2 would be better if we have several counters that also want to access the same counter variable. So if we had a counter 3 and we want counter 3 and counter 2 to update the count variable whenever we call it, and it's only one count variable, that would work too. So there's a difference between counter 1 and counter 2 makes sense. If there's a specific question, ask it within the thread. Oh, I like the Batman symbol. That's a good one. So no questions on this. This makes sense. If it doesn't, go back and watch this when I post it. So it'll break it down again for you because we went over this a little quickly. But if there's questions, this is like the last 10 seconds to ask a question within the thread in Slack of asking about the differences. Okay. And then I'm gonna check Slido one more time before we leave. Okay, what is the virtue of creating an inline function versus extracting it? Okay, inline function was just because this was a very simple, where is my VS Code? Because this was a very simple function, literally it's just a one-liner, then doing it inline is pretty easy. You don't have to give it a name, it could be anonymous. It's just more so for cleanliness. But you can do something like this also for readability to make it a little bit better, how we separate it down into 3 different lines. You can actually read it a lot easier. I know students in the past used to be like, I don't understand what this is. And then once I broke it down to this, they're like, oh, it's just a function. So it just really depends on the readability of your user or somebody else looking at your code, another developer. If they're more junior, then something like this might make more sense. If you're dealing with more senior developers, something like this would totally make sense to them too. There's no one way to do what I did. You could do it this way and that's okay. You could do it that way and that's also okay. Either way, you're just passing in a function to another function. Okay. So that is it for today. We will have Q&A again today as well. It will be about an hour earlier and I'll put that in the chat. And I will also post this to the chat once it's done processing. Bye, everyone.